water on a salmon river. Alaska means frontier still to be conquered, men who are not afraid of hard going. Like other frontiers, those who forged a civilization across the American continent. It means snow-capped peaks and mighty glaciers. It means crystal clear lakes whose rocky shores have never felt the imprint of a white man's pockets of eternal snow. It means tall timber, muskeg, and tundra. Reading that stuff to Moose is like giving him a hot foot. Fish on! Fish on! Like most other people, we thought the famous Alaska Highway began right at the U.S.-Canadian border. In reality, it doesn't start for another 700 to 800 miles. The 0-mile post is in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, and there are 1,523 more of them between here and Fairbanks, Alaska. We pulled out of Dawson Creek about noontime. It was hard to believe that with 11 days, we still had about 10 hours more of daylight to drive in. Being construction men ourselves, when we thought of the problems of pushing even a gravel highway through the wilderness, we were pretty impressed with what we saw. For my money, they ought to make this highway a dedicated memorial to American and Canadian armies and engineers who built it in such a short time during the emergency of war. It sort of makes you proud that we can pull something like this out of our sleeve when we have to. Every stream and lake we passed looked better than the last one. If we had stopped at every place in Canada that looked like fishing, we never would have got to Alaska. Finally, we couldn't stand it any longer. We pulled off the road and down to a lake for our first taste of fishing along the Alaska Highway. We've been unloading boats and outboards for a long time, so we had the boat heading for the water in a jiffy. Maybe too much of a jiffy. When I finally got to my feet, I yelled to Moose. "Hey," I said. "Hey, wait a minute. That's no way to treat a boat." "I know it isn't," said Moose, "but the way this boat is built, scraping it over a few rocks won't hurt it a bit. Come on, let's get the motor." But eager as we were to get fishing, we took the time to mix our outboard fuel right. First, we filled our supply tank half full of gasoline. Then we added the right amount of recommended oil. Working with machinery the way we do every day, we know that no motor will do its best work unless you give it the right fuel. So we do ourselves and our outboard a favor by following the manufacturer's recommendations to the letter, making sure everything is kept clean so no foreign matter gets in. We close the tank and shake it until the fuel is well mixed. Then we put the rest of the gasoline in and shake some more. Sure, all this takes a couple of minutes extra, but it pays off in good motor operation all day. 2 more minutes and we'll be out on the lake for our first fishing along the Alaska Highway. Our gear was stowed in the boat, even rain gear. We were equally ready for bad weather and good fishing. And the book said you could expect both in the North Country. There's something about dropping a lure into strange water that always fills me with excitement. Well, it wasn't the biggest fish in the lake, but it was the first one we caught. Those Canadian lakes are all right. We marked a couple of bucks off our food budget long before a new batch of weather suddenly moved in. That's no idle rumor about rain in the North Country. It can rain there without half a lot of water up there, and we got about half of it in the boat before the rain stopped. Even a boat that never leaks can't keep old Ma Nature from pouring it in topside. Well, while Moose was bailing, he came up with a honey of an idea. Why doesn't somebody build an outboard motor that bails your boat? It would sure save a lot of work, he said. I told him some smart manufacturer would do just that one of these days. One afternoon, we stopped to watch an awe-inspiring spectacle, one of the greatest of nature's tragedies. It was not a pleasant sight. Thousands of acres of nature's wonderland turning to smoke and charred ruins. Never in our lifetime will those magnificent trees be replaced. Only God can make a tree. That line of Joyce Kilmer's chokes in your throat as you watch God's work go up in smoke, destroying every living thing in the fire's path. Nature tries to cover the scars of fire with natural beauty, but still the black and seared fingers reach toward the heavens, as if calling down a judgment upon those of us who, through carelessness and indifference, destroy nature's bounty. This was the darndest thing that happened to us on the whole trip. You'd never guess what we found ourselves towing. A disabled plane. The pilot had run into some minor trouble and set her down on a lake we were fishing. I always believed that when you're out hunting or fishing, you never lose by doing somebody a good turn. And giving this bush pilot a hand was no exception. It ended up with us fishing a river way in the back country that you could reach only by air. When we beached the plane, Moose told the pilot he ought to have a motor like this just in case. Yeah, it's not a bad idea, the pilot said, as we shook hands all around. Well, while we were taking the pilot to his home a few miles away, Moose asked him where we could find some good grayling fishing. The pilot said he knew just the river for grayling, way back in the bush. And then he surprised us by saying he'd fly us in, and for free. Well, 2 days later, the pilot was setting us down on a lake in the bush country. From here, a trail led to the river we were to fish. The pilot was going to drop us off and then return to pick us up that evening. As soon as we had unloaded our tackle, he pointed out the trail to the river, and off we went. It was a kind of funny feeling, being left out there in the wilderness. Even happy-go-lucky Moose didn't like to hear that plane leaving. But fishing for grayling soon made us forget all about that. Now, the grayling is not a spectacular fighter, but a 4-ounce sweetheart rod is just made for them. And we got plenty of action. There's no fish any more beautiful than an Arctic grayling. They look like a miniature sailfish without the bill. Well, as usual, after we got a couple to eat, and grayling is fine eating, let me tell you, we removed the barbs from the hooks so we could easily turn back the fish. The pilot was sure right about that river. By the time he picked us up that afternoon, we had seen grayling fishing at its best. This is Old Bill, a genuine Alaskan sourdough. Old Bill knows the Kenai Peninsula like the back of his hand. "Yeah, you've sure come to the right place for salmon," he said. He told us that the spring run was on, and we'd have no trouble taking all the fish we wanted out of the rivers that empty into Cook Inlet here on the Kenai Peninsula. For 3 or 4 weeks in the spring, the great Chinook or king salmon run up these waterways to spawn. And when the call goes out, "Fish in the river!" all other activity stops. A big king is a trophy for any sport fisherman. The next morning found us getting breakfast on the banks of the Anchor River. Of course, we knew Bill was exaggerating a little. Kings couldn't be that big or that easy to catch. Could they? Wow! We forgot all about breakfast and got out on that river on the double. 2 hours later, and not a hit. Well, how do you like that? It was almost as big as the boy was. We found out later that he had fished the Anchor River ever since he could remember. His father was a homesteader, and his family lived on a bluff overlooking the river. Fishing wasn't a matter of technique with him. It was just a matter of putting meat in the family pot. Moose asked him why he wasn't fishing. The boy said he had lost his hook on a big fish and didn't have any more. "Ah, we can fix that," said Moose. He took the boy over to our tackle box and picked out the first hook that came to hand. But the boy had spotted what he wanted. He asked, kind of shyly, "Can I have one of those with the eagle on it? That's the kind we always use." Moose grinned and gave the boy the kind of hook he wanted. Dynamite, as we came to call him, tied the hook on. He waded out in the stream in the very spot we had fished for 2 hours and strung on a big chunk of salmon eggs. Well, maybe, as salmon fishermen say, the 4 o'clock run was just coming through. Anyway, he made a cast like a pro, and whang! He was tied into a king that went crazy. From the moment we gave Dynamite a new hook, we had ourselves a fishing partner. He was about as nice a kid as you're likely to meet, and he knew that stretch of river and the habits of the salmon like a book. It wasn't long till we began connecting with some of those kings ourselves. When it comes to rating a fish for eating purposes, a fat, bright, fresh-run king is top man on our totem pole. Moose had the right solution. He said, let's just hang him up like a side of beef and eat on him till he's gone. You've never lived until you eat a couple of steaks cut off nice and thick, fried in butter. It's hard on the waistline, but you'll lose it the next day fighting the fish's brother. The next morning, when we walked upstream to the same pool, Dynamite was perched on his favorite rock waiting for us. Every time you looked at him, he looked more like an Alaskan version of Huck Finn, except we had found out he was in the top of his class in school as well as in fishing. The day before, we had noticed that silent yearning in his eyes as he watched us fishing with our new solid Nyla-glass casting rods. Well, Moose had a pair of them, and darned if he didn't take one along and give it to the boy. Now, why don't I ever think of things like that? Dynamite didn't take long to test the new outfit. I never did find out how he could hit a salmon's mouth at 50 paces. Dynamite had watched us turn back kings for a couple of days. And finally he said, I've been telling my dad about you fellas turning back fish. And he says he'll come down to your camp tomorrow morning and show you how to can them so you can take some home. When we heard that, we started fishing on purpose. When we started back to camp that evening, we had our limits tied to our pack boards. Imagine eating salmon you canned yourself. I thought you needed a whole cannery for that. The next morning it was trying to rain when Dynamite's dad appeared on the trail lugging a pressure cooker and a can sealer. We were ready for it. We had driven to a small town and got some cans. They're easy to find in that country because so many people use them. Well, Dynamite's dad had done this 1,000 times. He said it was simple as ABC. Here's the way he showed us how to do it. First, you trim the fish, removing the tail, head, fins, and the thin flesh on the underside of the fish. You save this strip to fill cans that are not completely filled. The cans are put in boiling water to sterilize them. A few minutes in boiling water fixes them up fine. Now, take the cans and put a teaspoon of salt in the bottom of each one. Then cut the salmon into lengths to fit the can. We just use the can itself for a measuring stick. This cut fills the can right to the top. If it didn't, we would have used some of that strip from the underside. The next step is pre-cooking. This heats the meat throughout and takes about 10 minutes. When the cans and meat have finished pre-cooking, they go to the sealer to put the lids on. The can sealer crimps the lid over the edge of the can and makes an airtight seal. With about an inch of water boiling in the pressure cooker, the sealed cans are put in. Close the cooker and turn up the heat. When the gauge shows 15 pounds pressure, adjust the fire and cook for 2 hours. Well, this is a swell time for a pot of coffee and a bull session. When the cooking was finished, we released the steam and let the pressure gauge go back to 0 before taking off the cover. We took the hot cans out and dumped them in a landing net. The cans have to be cooled, and we figured there was no better place to do that than in the icy waters of a salmon river. Won't we be the fair-haired boys back home when we start passing these out? Well, the days are a lot longer in Alaska, but vacations there seem just as short as anywhere else, maybe shorter. On the last day we fished, we were after northern pike. You know, you can never trust a pike. And when this one acted up, Moose said, "If the fish are going to bite us, I guess it is time to go home." When we were packing, Moose said this was the longest portage we ever made. You know, I kept thinking it was just as long going back and wondering how our funds were holding up. But thanks to holding a firm rein on both Moose and our purse, we were sitting pretty for the trip home. As we were going outside, that's what the people of Alaska say when they leave the country, we visited the docks in one of Alaska's many beautiful cities. The same docks that have been there for years and years. What a comparison. An old fishing boat, still working, as it had worked in these waters for 50 years, long before the Alaskan skyline boasted the silhouette of a skyscraper. It was sure a land of contrasts, this last great American frontier. A land our forefathers never knew when, as Lincoln put it, they brought forth upon this continent a new nation. Yet, here was the blue and gold emblem of a rich and varied part of that nation. Above it, those broad stripes and bright stars waved in the long gleaming of an Alaskan twilight. Here, a midnight sun shines on a new frontier of opportunity, a new rampart of freedom.